Pierrette Louin, the teenager who sabotaged trains and forged papers for Jews, April 6, 1944. 1:15 a.m., a moonless sky over the Limoges region, central France. The roar of a British Handley Page Halifax bomber vibrates through the thin metal fuselage. Standing at the edge of the open drop hole, staring down into the freezing, pitch-black abyss, is Pierrette Louin. She is 23 years old. The wind threatens to tear the heavy canvas parachute pack from her back. Below her lies occupied Europe. It is a fortress of searchlights, anti-aircraft flak, and Gestapo hunting parties. If she jumps, she has an average life expectancy of 6 weeks. The dispatcher taps her on the shoulder. The red light above the door turns green. Pierrette does not hesitate. She pushes herself forward and vanishes into the slipstream, plummeting into the dark at 120 miles per hour. She is carrying false identification papers under the name Pierrette Selina, a cyanide pill sewn into her collar, and the specialized deadly knowledge of a clandestine radio operator. History is often messy. Over the decades, the fog of war can distort the truth, sometimes blending the stories of different resistance fighters into a single romanticized legend. You might have heard the myths that Pierrette Louin was a lone teenager outrunning the Gestapo, single-handedly derailing trains in the night and forging thousands of papers for Jewish refugees in Parisian basements. While those specific acts of teenage rebellion belong to other incredible young women of the era, Pierrette's actual documented history is arguably even more astonishing. She wasn't an untrained civilian improvising in the shadows. She was a highly trained, specialized soldier. She was part of a groundbreaking military experiment that terrified the German high command. She was a Merlinette. To understand how a young woman from North Africa ended up falling through the French sky, we have to look back to a world where women were strictly forbidden from fighting. Pierrette Denise Louin was born on October 1st, 1920, in Oran, Algeria. At the time, Algeria was a French territory. She grew up under the Mediterranean sun, far removed from the political tensions boiling over in Europe. When the Second World War broke out in 1939, Pierrette was 19 years old. She watched from across the sea as the French Republic was crushed by the German Blitzkrieg in just 6 weeks. For 2 years, the collaborationist Vichy regime controlled North Africa. But in November 1942, the world tilted on its axis. Operation Torch, the massive Allied invasion of North Africa, brought American and British tanks rolling onto the beaches of Algeria and Morocco. The region was liberated. Suddenly, the Free French forces had a staging ground to prepare for the reconquest of their homeland. But the French military had a massive problem. They were desperately short of manpower. General Henri Giraud and Colonel Lucien Merlin realized that a modern mechanized army required a massive logistical and communications network. They needed switchboard operators, signal analysts, and radio technicians so that the men could be freed up for frontline combat. In early 1943, they broke centuries of strict military tradition and created the Corps Féminin des Transmissions, Women's Signal Corps. Pierrette Louin, now 22, was one of the very first to volunteer. She walked into the recruitment office in Algiers and committed herself to the war effort. She was joined by other fiercely patriotic young women, including Eugénie Gendy, Marie-Louise Clorec, and Suzanne Murtzisen. Because they were commanded by Colonel Merlin, the men of the regular army gave them a nickname. They called them the Merlinettes. The training in North Africa was intense. They were taught military discipline, encryption, and the complex mechanics of radio communication. But the British Special Operations Executive, SOE, was watching. The SOE needed native French speakers to infiltrate occupied France, coordinate with the local resistance, and prepare for the upcoming D-Day landings. They specifically wanted women. A woman could move through a German checkpoint much easier than a military-aged man. When a call went out for the absolute best radio specialists to volunteer for highly classified, suicidal missions behind enemy lines, Pierrette Louin stepped forward. She was shipped to England. The training shifted from standard military signaling to the dark arts of espionage. In the clandestine training camps of St. Albans and Manchester, Pierrette learned how to kill a man with her bare hands. She learned how to handle plastic explosives. She learned how to survive a Gestapo interrogation. She was taught that her radio was her only weapon, but it was also a homing beacon that would bring the enemy straight to her door. This brings us back to the freezing night of April 6, 1944. Pierrette's parachute jerks open, arresting her fall. She lands hard in a dark field in the Limoges region. She quickly buries her silk parachute and makes contact with the local resistance cell. Her mission is critical. She is there to act as the communication bridge between London and the French underground. She transmits the coordinates for weapons drops. She helps coordinate the exact sabotage operations, including the blowing up of railways and the derailing of German troop trains that will cripple the Nazi reinforcements ahead of the Normandy invasion. While she may not have been planting the dynamite under the tracks herself, Pierrette was the one calling in the explosives. Without her radio, the resistance was blind and unarmed. The stress of the job was unimaginable. Pierrette moved constantly, carrying her heavy, illegal radio concealed in a suitcase. She transmitted from freezing barns and cramped attics, always watching the clock. She knew the German radio detection vans, the goniometers, were patrolling the streets, triangulating her signal. To blend in, she traveled to Paris, staying with a cousin and utilizing the false papers she had been issued in London. She walked past SS officers on the streets of the capital, a 23-year-old spy hiding in plain sight. But the Gestapo was closing the net. The French resistance was riddled with informants, and the German intelligence services were highly efficient. On April 27, 1944, just 3 weeks after she dropped into France, Pierrette Louin's luck ran out. The Gestapo ambushed her. She was arrested alongside her fellow Merlinettes, Marie-Louise Clorec and Suzanne Murtzisen. The women were dragged to the infamous Fresnes prison on the outskirts of Paris. The interrogation was brutal. The Gestapo knew exactly what they had captured. They wanted the transmission codes. They wanted the locations of the drop zones. They subjected the women to horrific physical and psychological torture. Pierrette Louin, the girl from Oran, looked at the most terrifying secret police force in the world and refused to speak. She gave them absolutely nothing. She protected the resistance network with her silence. Because she refused to break, she was classified as a political prisoner of the highest order. In August 1944, as the Allies were fighting their way toward Paris, the Germans hastily packed Pierrette and her comrades onto a sweltering, filthy cattle train. They were deported to Ravensbrück, the notorious concentration camp for women in northern Germany. In Ravensbrück, Pierrette was stripped of her name and given a number. She endured starvation, backbreaking slave labor, and freezing conditions. But the survivors later recalled that the Merlinettes never lost their military bearing. They stayed together. They supported the weaker prisoners. They remained soldiers of the French Republic, even in hell. By January 1945, the Third Reich was in its death throes. The Soviet army was rapidly advancing from the east. The Gestapo issued a direct order from Berlin. Highly trained intelligence operatives were not to survive to see liberation. On the afternoon of January 18, 1945, the camp loudspeakers echoed across the frozen roll call square. Pierrette Louin's number was called. She was summoned to the camp office along with Suzanne Murtzisen, Marie-Louise Clorec, and Eugénie Gendy. They knew they were not being transferred. They knew they were going to die. Pierrette Louin was 24 years old. Accounts from the camp state that the four women did not weep. They walked to the execution grounds, near the crematorium, with quiet, unbreakable dignity. They were lined up against the wall and shot by an SS firing squad. Their bodies were immediately burned. They were murdered just months before the war ended. For a long time, the stories of the female operatives were buried. The post-war governments were eager to promote the image of the male resistance fighter, but the sacrifices made by women like Pierrette were too monumental to be erased. She was posthumously declared Morte pour la France. She was awarded the Chevalier of the Légion d'honneur, the Croix de Guerre, and the Médaille de la Résistance. Her name is carved into the Tansford Memorial in England, and a street in Toulouse bears her name today. History might occasionally confuse the details of her life with those of other young resistance fighters. But the truth of Pierrette Louin requires no embellishment. She was a young woman who left the safety of the Mediterranean sun to drop into the darkest, most violent epicenter of the Second World War. She learned the terrifying art of clandestine warfare, weaponized the airwaves against the Nazi Empire, and faced a firing squad without breaking her silence. She is a reminder that the most lethal soldiers do not always carry rifles. Sometimes they carry a Morse key and a heart of absolute iron. If the true story of Pierrette Louin moved you today, please consider leaving a like to help us honor her incredible sacrifice. Subscribe to the channel to discover more hidden, accurate histories of the women who shaped our world from the shadows. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and thank you for helping us keep their true memory alive.